I say of this Royal Commission that it was a government election commitment to have a Royal Commission, and in the Honourable Julia Gillard, they have a person with a high level of experience in governance, a level of interest in early childhood education, and an understanding of how the system works. I disagree with many of the things she did as Prime Minister, and I disagree with her fundamentally in relation to her politics, but she is a qualified individual to fulfil this role, and I know she's thrown herself into it with enthusiasm. She's been given a task by this government to deliver an election policy that they were too blasé or disinterested or lazy to write the detail of themselves ahead of the election. And indeed, it's a significant task to describe how you would change the system to introduce three-year-old preschool from 2026. We are very clear, and we've got it in black and white in the government's policy documents that and in their posters, this was expected to see universal three-year-old preschool from 2026. And I think families voting expected that to mean that they would get a preschool-type program for their three-year-old, similar to their four-year-old, available at a public preschool or at a long daycare service with an agreement. And indeed, of course, that is free of charge for those four-year-olds. I think that families voting on this expected that would apply for their family if they had a three-year-old in 2026. It's months and months since the government walked away from that, to the point where they didn't ask the Royal Commissioner to design that. They provided terms of reference, which the Commissioner has delivered in an interim report, which meet those terms of reference. And then the government, having walked away from their commitment to provide universal three-year-old preschool for every child from 2026, having decided the Royal Commissioner has to do all of the hard work, all of the detail work, they've then produced this document, which is on the Royal Commission's website, the South Australian Government response to the interim report. So having declined to do the hard work themselves, we then find over about 5 pages no less than 16 examples of passive-aggressive criticism of the Royal Commission in their work. And I say to the Minister and I say to the government, if you didn't like what the Royal Commission proposed, it might have been more polite to do so in a polite and constructive way, to put forward some suggestions, maybe even to, rather than having a policy of having a Royal Commission to do the work, maybe even just design the program yourselves, rather than giving the Royal Commissioner a task and then having a go at the Commission in so many ways. I found no less than 16 occasions where we see phrases like the Royal Commission is encouraged to undertake further research. The government encourages the Royal Commission to consider whether this method of capacity management may result in unintended consequences. The government would welcome further consideration. The Commission is encouraged to consider. The Commission is encouraged to look further. The government would welcome clarity, particularly pointed if you have heard Department of Education bureaucrats and officials write memos. That is pointed. I like this one. The government is willing to participate in further discussions with the Royal Commission. That was a very generous one in relation to workforce. The government would welcome further testing of this assumption. I think the thesaurus ran out at some point because then there were a stream of the government would welcome the Royal Commission identifying. The Royal Commission may wish to consider, and we're repeating the Royal Commission may wish to consider. The government encourages the Royal Commission. This sort of language is bureaucratic. But in terms of the 16 points that it raises, it is very clear the government is unhappy with the interim report, and I think they should be more respectful of the Royal Commission. We'll go through the issues. In relation to the interim report stating, and I'm quoting from the government document here, the interim report states there are many families who value government preschool over and above long daycare, as demonstrated through four-year-olds attending both long daycare and government preschool. How the government is aware that the session times in government preschools often don't meet the needs of working families, and that opportunities to provide before and after care at government preschools need to be further explored. The Royal Commission is encouraged to undertake further research to test its assumptions about likely pattern of demand and usage. Potentially useful, the government could have provided such information in its original submission. The government goes on to talk about what is in fact this issue of progressive universalism. Indeed, in its introduction, the government says the Royal Commission's principle of progressive universal is welcome, and the value of preschool as a means to reduce disadvantage, yet contradictorily they also talk about the findings of the need to provide universal high-quality 3-year-old preschool in South Australia. The question is the government seeking to provide universal service for all South Australians, or are they providing a progressive universal service which is designed particularly to support some South Australians and not other? They can't have it both ways, sir. The government talks about how under current policy every child can have access to a high school preschool program in their local government preschool in the year before full-time school. And they say this policy aims to ensure that preschool is accessible and low cost. The government points out where a 3-year-old preschool is delivered through long daycare, a child's local preschool program may be delivered by a long daycare service, with the family meeting the gap between childcare subsidy funding and the cost of the program. The government would welcome further consideration of how the model can meet the aspiration for every child to have access to their local preschool program. And it goes on to also talk about being critical of the Royal Commission. The government talks about preschool enrolments feeding into school enrolments. The point the government is seeking to make is that where the Royal Commission suggests that new need for 3-year-old preschool who aren't currently being supported in long daycare will be provided in new government preschools, and this is a cohort of children who are vulnerable, children who aren't accessing 3-year-old long daycare now tend to be vulnerable children. The point the government and the department make here is if all of those children go into the new preschool places and those children continue in the 4-year-old preschool places, then is that going to create pockets of particular disadvantage rather than having our preschools reflecting the whole of their local communities? If wealthier families with long daycare have all of their children's preschool services provided in long daycare sites, and all of the children who aren't in long daycare now, particularly vulnerable, are provided in government preschools, that, sir, exacerbates disadvantage and inequity. And that is a concern that's being raised here, but it is the necessary corollary of the task that the government set the Royal Commissioner. If this was their concern that it be avoided, then it was something that the government could have turned its mind to before describing this policy. And that is one of the concerns that we've expressed with this policy as well. It's interesting that when we talk about this mixed model where the government's trying to have its cake and eat it too, because as they said earlier, the government sees value in the mixed model approach that is likely to have the broadest reach, it makes its greatest use of existing capacity, and it's likely to be the quickest to roll out. So the government's in favour of the mixed model, but then we've got 16 reasons and concerns with it, and it is very clear that there is a disconnect between what the government is saying and what the government is writing to the Royal Commission. The government says they'd like further clarity on how the proposed model of 3-year-old preschool will interact with the existing 4-year-old program, and I think that that is particularly related to the point I was just making before about whether those 3-year-olds will continue in the same service. Because, of course, part of the benefit, if you're going to have a 3-year-old preschool program, is that it is seen as 1 2-year program for the child. If you have some kids doing 12 months in their long daycare centre with the expectation that they'll continue to follow historical trends in the numbers at a local level and do their 4-year-old preschool at the local public preschool, that's not a 2-year preschool model. That is a disjointed setting here, transition, and then a third transition to school before a child's turned 5. That is a risk to that child. The government talks about workforce, and they'd welcome further clarity from the Royal Commission on proposed staffing configurations. That's a difficult challenge ahead. It's not an unreasonable question to ask, and the Royal Commission, the Commissioner particularly attended to this in the media she did on the day she announced her interim report. We'll be very interested to see how they do it. I think it particularly talks to the unachievable promise the government made when they said that people would have this in 2026. The government says the Royal Commission has found that irrespective of the model chosen for 3-year-old preschool, it is likely that impending changes to the childcare subsidy will result in more families choosing long daycare centres for their 4-year-old preschool program, despite it being more costly than government preschool. The government would welcome further testing of this assumption as part of considering family choice, particularly in light of rising cost of living pressures. That is, of course, the nub of the challenge we've been describing. I think that in terms of the breakup of responsibility between state and Commonwealth, the government has welcomed that the Royal Commission has requested that the Commonwealth do some extra heavy lifting. I don't mind that idea as well, but I do make the point that when they talk about, in relation to the national conversation, infrastructure needs, the government says in community-managed early childhood education and services in regional and remote areas, while the Royal Commission has recommended that the state government consider taking on this role, it's arguable this may better align with a role in ensuring the accessibility of services, i.e. the Commonwealth should be doing it. Putting the government on notice that this is something we're watching very closely. I expect the Royal Commission probably will recommend that the state government take on this responsibility. It's one that is intense interest to many members on this side of the House, and if the state government tries to shirk that responsibility of the Commonwealth, it'll be just an example of them promising one thing and delivering another. Sir, I commend the bill to the House, but I have significant reservations about how the government proposes to proceed in these areas.